All right, guys, second installment of the Unit 2. We're talking about interaction between the branches, sticking with the legislative branch. And we're going to talk specifically about, well, let's take a look. All right, we're going to talk specifically about each house. What does it entail? Who is part of it? What are some of the demographics, we'll say, of that House of Representatives and that Senate? So let's start with the lower house, the House of Representatives, right? The House of Representatives are directly elected by the eligible voters in their district. Members of the House of Representatives are meant to be close to the people and their wishes. So think about the state of Ohio, 16 representatives, 16 districts, and they're elected only by those people who live in that district. Right? Representatives serve a 2-year term, and this is a brief term. It was designed this way to keep them close and accountable to the people. But they were hoping that in a 2-year time period, it also gives them enough time to kind of become competent in their work, understand what's going on. But in those 2 years, if you're not doing your job, boom, representatives out, right? And so it's a short term, and it's directly related to the people that you are representing, right? What's it take to qualify? And the terms, we talked about the terms, those are 2 years. But in order to be a representative, you have to be at least 25 years old, a resident of your state, and a citizen of the United States for at least 7 years. So what does that mean? That means that you do not have to be born in the United States. Now, while the Constitution didn't bar women from holding office originally, the states usually did and excluded all but a few. Generally, maybe a widow with property if your husband was in a seat before that. And so women did not typically, originally, were not really part of this. Not necessarily disqualified, but most of the states didn't allow it. So who makes up these representatives? Well, there are 435. That number's been capped at 435 from 1912. But the number is divided out to states based on their population, right? So of those 435, every 10 years we have a census. It counts up the population. There is a whole algorithm associated with how they are dispersed. But essentially, the more populous the state, the more numbers that they get, with each state getting a minimum of one representative. A couple things that are exclusive as far as powers to the House of the Representatives. Number one, any bill dealing with revenue, money, right? It has to be initiated in the House of Representatives. The power of impeachment in order to bring charges to or indict someone with a crime, that is done in the House of Representatives. And then the House Rules Committee, this group sets a strict limits on the debate times. This gives the Speaker of the House a lot of power when implementing these rules. The House Rules Committee, they don't have those limits really over in the Senate side because there's far fewer. Imagine with 435 representatives, if you didn't set rules with limits on the debate, how long some of these things could just drag and drag and drag. All right. The U.S. Constitution mandates the House represents a single member districts with approximate equal numbers of constituents. Therefore, every 10 years, a census is taken by the federal government to count the population, determine the number of each state's congressional districts. That's just the number of them, right? Each state then must redraw its congressional boundaries to ensure that each district is equal in population. So we got kind of a balancing act that we're doing here, right? If you look over time, when we first started in 1790 to 2000, we're up to 2010 right now. The 2020 census is going to change some of these. But if you look, the originals, they represented about 40,000 people. Today, all the way up this scale, each representative represents around 670,000 people. So, based on the census, the federal government is going to adjust the number of districts given to each state. So, for example, if Ohio, which did recently happen in the last in the last census, if the population of other states grows tremendously, or Ohio's would drop tremendously, run through that algorithm, they could actually lose representatives. This happens with shifts, large shifts in growing places. Texas is a fast growing. New Mexico, Arizona, Florida even grows, right? And Colorado has grown quite a bit. This is called apportionment, right? This is the distribution among the states based on the population of each of the states. So this is where apportionment is where they're going to say Ohio gets X, Michigan gets Y, Texas gets Z, and that calculation is all set up. But it's also based on this census. The states themselves will adjust their districts to equal districts based on population. So think about, again, looking at Ohio. If a lot of people are moving to the city or moving to Cincinnati that used to be part of one district, they may have to actually split that up to encapsulate and even out those districts, right? So that's called reapportionment. So apportionment, state to state, reapportionment within the state. That's the redistribution of congressional seats after the census determines changes in population distribution among that state. So congressional reapportionment is done by each state's legislature. Now, this is really, really important. The political party that's in control of the state legislature is responsible for redrawing these districts. Now, imagine what could be done if you're in charge. Now, you are supposed to fairly draw these. The districts are supposed to be drawn so that this constituency have things in common, so that they are, kind of all of the in the same area per se, right? There are rules; they have to be continuous and contiguous. In other words, you can't just pick a county out in the middle of Southwest Ohio and have it be part of or representative by somebody in Southeast Ohio, way apart, right? As much as it's legally possible, the legislature is going to what they call gerrymander the district boundaries to give the majority party an advantage in future elections. Um, that is politics. Gerrymandering in itself, or I should say, redistricting in a way for your own advantage, is not necessarily illegal or immoral. However, there is a lot of controversy, right? Only the state of Iowa is currently uses an independent commission to redraw those congressional districts. So when we talk about congressional districting, right, this is the drawing by the state legislatures of these congressional districts. So again, state of Ohio gets 16 districts. Somebody has to sit down and draw those. So they literally grab a map and start drawing on it to break these districts up to represent the same equal amount of people in each one, or at least as close as they can get it. Gerrymandering, you hear that term used quite a bit. This is drawing that congressional districts in favor of one political party or another group over another. This actually comes from a famous 1812 cartoon of a Senate district in Massachusetts created under a guy named Elbridge Gerry, right? And so you can see this is kind of, this was the cartoon how he created this district that rolled in this big, odd-looking shape, and somebody said that it looked like a lizard, and that is a gerrymander. So, results of gerrymandering can have some real lasting political impacts. For example, and this is a case, the Ohio Supreme Court, or I'm sorry, the Supreme Court in the court system is currently evaluating the legality of the Ohio districting. And if you look at this historically, Ohio is really close to 50-50 affiliation with Republican or Democrat, and those numbers aren't always exact. If you look at various Democratic and Republican, this is like just presidential election results. You can see sometimes it's higher on the Democratic side, sometimes it's higher, but it's historically pretty close as you go through all of these. Some years there's some independents that pop in there, right? But based on the gerrymandering of 2010, the districts in the House of Representative seats actually show up as 12 seats to 4 seats in favor of the Republican Party. And so you can see, Democrats can only maintain control, or only gain control, I should say, over 4 out of the 16, which is about 25%. And so you can see that now that they control that function, it makes Ohio appear, at least, very one-sided in our political affiliations. All right, so there are 2 famous cases that we want to talk about. One man, one vote. This is Baker versus Carr in 1962. What we have is that we're in the state of Tennessee. You can see there by that map. The Supreme Court addresses fairness in reapportionment and redistricting process. Essentially, the Tennessee General Assembly had not redrawn its maps since 1900, right? And this is actually a violation of the Tennessee state constitution that required that redistricting every 10 years. The 1960 census showed there was this huge demographic shift over a 60-year period that occurred in that state. And so the court ruled that the Tennessee did violate the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment because districts were not proportionally represented. In other words, this district here may have had, twice the population, so those people only had, half the influence that they should if these were proportioned properly. That's one case. The second is 1993 Shaw versus Reno. The question in this was, can states draw new congressional districts with race in mind? And this has gotten brought up again in several other states, but this was one of the more famous ones. But it's gotten brought up again recently. And after the 1990 census, North Carolina submitted its congressional district map to U.S. Attorney General Janet Reno to comply with this 1965 Voting Rights Act. Right? Reno and the Justice Department required the state to reconfigure these districts because there was only one majority black district. In other words, they wanted it rewritten based on race. So the state complied and redrew the lines. But when they did that, this really very bizarrely shaped district came about. It's called the I-85 district because at one point it barely straddled each side of the roads of I-75. So if you look at this map, this is the district, and you can see at some points, again, because it needs to be contiguous and connected, you can see it comes all the way here, and it's just these thin strips, and then it picks up a big area, and it comes back down to these little thin strips, and then here it's just barely down. And so somehow from Charlotte to Durham, this long distance, and Greenboro in between, Winston-Salem, right? This long distances, this somehow ends up being one district. and it really is not very representative. North Carolina residents then challenged the plan as a violation of the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. In fact, they argued that these unusually shaped districts, drawn with race in mind, right, violated their rights. So the court actually invalidated the district in question because its boundaries were neither contiguous nor compact. That's the kind of the rules on how they're supposed to be, and they were drawn with the intent to discriminate through the use of racial gerrymandering. In other words, they wrote this district up or drew this district up to encapsulate, say, all of the African American votes. And by putting them all in one district, it allowed the other districts to be predominantly white. Um, the court ruled that any racial gerrymandering by the state required a compelling state interest, and it did not see the compelling interest in this district, that it didn't make sense. All right. So now let's talk about the Senate. Senators are more insulated from the public and any passions that might sweep through the populace, adding stability to the legislative branch. With Shays' rebellions fresh in their minds, many of the delegates wanted the Constitutional Convention, or at the Constitutional Convention, were concerned about the ability of the poor majority to take away the property of the wealthy. So Madison argued this should serve as a defense of the people against their own temporary errors and illusions. So originally, the qualifications fall like this: you got to be at least 30 years old, 5 years older than a House of Representatives. The citizens from at least 9 years, 2 years longer, and they must live in their state that they seek to represent. The Constitution doesn't limit the number of terms representative or Senate can serve. And now, in the original Constitution, states elected their own, or chose, I should say, their own senators. However, the 17th Amendment replaced the indirect election of senators by state legislatures with a direct popular election. Right? There are 100 members, 2 senators per state. The senator serves the entire state. Now, these guys serve 6-year terms, with 1/3 of the Senate coming up for re-election or for election every 2 years. So we don't replace the whole Senate every 6 years. Every 2 years, we replace 1/3 of them, or I should say, we re-elect or elect 1/3 of them. All right. So a couple things exclusive to the Senate: they approve appointments and treaties. They vote to convict or fire officials. So remember, the House impeaches, these guys convict. There is a term called the filibuster, right? This is when a debate is going on or a vote is about to be cast. This is the nonstop talking to delay action on the bill. So you can sit there. Strom Thurmond one time argued for 24 hours or spoke for 24 hours. However, there is a counter to that called cloture. This stops a filibuster. If 16 senators sign a petition and then 3/5, or at least 60 senators, vote to invoke cloture, then it goes to a vote. The filibuster is broken. All right, so let's wrap this up. Just a real quick. This is the House. This is the Senate. You can kind of see what the differences between those are. If you hit pause, you can kind of see kind of the upper house here, the lower house here, and some of the specifics. All right, man, that's the end. Trying to keep it under 20 minutes. It is hard to get it all in. This is not all inclusive, but I hope you enjoyed it. We'll talk at you again. Come to me with questions. Thanks, guys. Talk to you soon.